My boss dumped the tip jar on the floor and made me count it on my knees while the whole dinner shift laughed. I showed him whose name was on the lease. The jar was a 2-liter Kilner with a slot cut in the lid, and when it went over on the tiles by the pass, it did not smash, which I have always thought was a shame. It made a sound instead. Coins on quarry tile in a room that had about 40 covers in it and a Saturday night volume, and the sound cut through all of it. That specific bright clatter that makes every single head in a restaurant turn, because everybody knows what dropped money sounds like. And then it went quiet in the way rooms do. Emmerich stood there with the empty jar in his hand and said, "Right, count it." I said, "Sorry?" And he said, "You lot reckon it's short every week, so count it. Go on." And he pointed at the floor. I want to describe the 11 seconds that followed with as much accuracy as I can manage, because they are the reason I have written any of this down. I looked at Kez, who was on the pass, and Kez looked at the board. I looked at Marnie, who had been on that floor with me for 4 years, and Marnie went and got a tray from the dumbwaiter that nobody needed. And then I got down on my knees on the tiles in a black shirt and an apron in front of 11 staff and about 40 people who could see straight through the pass, and I started picking up 2-pound coins. Somebody laughed, then somebody else. 2 of the commis near the walk-in, and I want to be fair to them, because one was 19 and one was 20, and neither of them has ever been able to look me in the face since, and one of them has apologized properly and one of them hasn't. It took about 4 minutes. 212.40. 4 minutes is a very long time. That's the thing nobody understands about it who wasn't there. If he'd shouted at me, it would have lasted 8 seconds and I'd have got over it in a fortnight. Shouting is a thing that happens to you. This was a thing I had to do. I had to keep choosing, coin by coin, for 4 minutes to stay on that floor, and every single one of those choices was mine. There's a 50-pence piece that went under the low fridge, and I had to lie down to reach it. I remember thinking, with my cheek about 4 inches off the tiles, that I could still see feet. Kez's clogs, Marnie's trainers, somebody's black shoes by the section station, not moving. And I remember deciding, down there, that I was going to get every single coin, because if I left one, he'd have said something about it. I put it on the pass and I said the number out loud, and Emmerich Sloat said, "There you go then," and walked off to the office, and I did the rest of my section. I did 4 more tables that night. I recommended a Malbec to a couple celebrating something. I have no memory of what. I've worked at the Larkspur since I was 17. That's 14 years, in one room, on a corner site that's had a restaurant in it since 1994. I started as a Saturday KP, and I have done every single job in that building except cook, and I could run 120 covers on a Friday in my sleep and have. My uncle Theodore ran it from 2011 until he died in 2018. He was my mother's older brother, and he was, in the completely unsentimental view of everybody who worked for him, a nightmare to work for and a good man. He shouted. He was hopeless with money. He once sacked a pot wash on a Tuesday and rehired him on the Wednesday, and neither of them ever mentioned it. He also paid for my mother's roof in 2015 and never told her where the money came from, and I found that out at his funeral. He died in the March of 2018, heart on the golf course 61, and the business was sold as a going concern the following spring to a company that Emmerich Sloat is a director of, and everything carried on with the same tables and the same tiles and about half the same staff. That's the whole background, and I want it understood that I loved that room. People assume, when they hear this story, that I hated the place. I didn't. That building has got about a third of my life in it. Emmerich took over properly in 2019, and for the first 2 years he was fine. He's a chef by training, which matters. He came off the stove into management and never really stopped thinking like a section cook, which is to say he thinks in terms of standards and pressure and everybody pulling their weight, and that is a perfectly good way to run a kitchen and a completely disastrous way to run a floor. But he wasn't a monster. He gave me a rota I could work around my mam's appointments in 2021. He came to Theodore's memorial thing and stood at the back and left early. What happened is that the money went wrong. There was a refit in 2023. New bar, new front, about 70 grand of it, and it did not do what he needed it to do. And there was a rent review coming, which I did not understand at the time and now understand extremely well. And there were letters he was not answering. And a frightened man who thinks like a section cook manages a floor by finding somebody to make an example of. It got worse over about 8 months, and I can date the stages because I've had 2 years and a lot of driving to think about it. March. He started doing the briefing standing up instead of leaning on the pass. Small thing. Nobody noticed but me, and I only noticed later. May. The first one in public. A KP called Ocean got a bollocking about a rack of glasses at the pass instead of in the office, and everybody pretended not to hear it. And afterward, Marnie said, "He's under it at the minute," and we all agreed that he was. He's under it at the minute. We said that about 11 times over 8 months. It's the restaurant version of "she's earned some peace," a warm sentence a group of people use to explain away the thing they've all decided not to deal with. August. The tips theory started. Not an accusation, just a remark about once a fortnight, always to the room rather than a person. Funny how it's always short on a Saturday. October. He took the jar off the shelf behind the bar and put it in the office and told us it was for security, and it came back out 4 days later after Kez said something. November. The floor. 8 months of a graph that everybody could see and nobody drew. He stopped doing it in the office and started doing it on the pass. He had a thing about the tips, a running theory that the floor was skimming before it went in the jar, which was not true and which he could not prove, and which he mentioned about once a fortnight. The night with the the jar was the 11th of November and it was the third bad service in a row. Here's what I did afterward, which was nothing. I finished my shift. I did my cash up. I said goodnight to Marnie in the car park and neither of us mentioned it. I went home and sat on the edge of my bed with my shoes still on for a while and then I went to bed. And the next morning I opened my banking app and looked at $340.16 and my rent was due on the 21st. And that is the entire reason I went back in on the Sunday. I want to sit on that for a second because when I have told this story out loud, the question is always, why didn't you just walk out? And it is asked by people who have never had $340.16 be the total of everything. Walking out costs money. You lose that week's pay, you lose the tips, which for me were about 70 quid a week, and were the difference between shopping at Lidl and shopping carefully at Lidl. You cannot claim anything for a fortnight. And in this town, there are maybe 9 places that pay above minimum, and I have worked in 4 of them. So on the Sunday at 4:30, I put a clean black shirt on and went back and did a double, and Emmerich said, "All right," to me at the pass, and I said, "Yeah, that's what actually happens. That's what it's like." And then something happened on that Sunday shift that mattered more than the jar, and it took me weeks to understand why. Marnie found me in the dry store at about 7 and said, "I'm sorry about last night." And I said, "It's fine." And she said, "It's not. I should have said something." And I said, "Marnie, if you'd said something, he'd have had you on the floor next to me." And she said, and this is the sentence, "Yeah, I know. That's why I didn't." Then she went back out to her section. There was nothing wrong with what she did. That's the part I had to sit with. She was 26 on £11.60 with a car on finance, and she did the arithmetic in about a second and a half, and she got it right. The 2 commas who laughed did the same arithmetic and got a different answer, which was, if you're laughing, you're on his side, and if you're on his side, you're not next. Every single person in that room made a rational decision in about 2 seconds, and the sum of 11 rational decisions was a woman on her knees. That's not a bad staff. That's what a frightened room does, and I have worked in enough of them to know it isn't personal, and knowing that does not help at all. What I did do, and this is where it turns, is I started trying to find out whether the place was going under, not for revenge, for planning. I wanted to know whether I was going to have a job in 6 months, because if I wasn't, I needed to start looking now, and I have watched 3 restaurants in this town close with 2 days' notice. So I did the thing anybody can do and almost nobody does. I looked the company up on the company's register. It's free. And what I found was accounts that were 9 months overdue, a charge registered against the company in 2023, and a filing history that had the specific shape of a business in trouble, everything late, everything minimum. And in among it, in the charge document, a reference to a lease. I did not know what I was looking at. I want to be clear that at this point I was a waitress reading a PDF at 11 at night with a cup of tea, understanding maybe a third of it. I need to say why I even knew where to start, because I looked the company up. Makes me sound like somebody with a skill I don't have. It's because of Theodore. When I was about 23, he was having a row with a supplier, and he sat me down at that office desk and showed me how to look a company up. Filings, directors, charges, the lot. Because his theory was that the supplier was about to go under, and he wanted to know before the invoices did. He was right, as it happens. They went under in the November. He taught me that on a Wednesday afternoon in an office with a bad chair, because he thought it was a useful thing for a person in this trade to know. 9 years later, I used the exact thing my uncle taught me, at that exact desk, to find out what my uncle had done to me. I have never known where to put that, and I'm not going to try. But you can get a copy of a registered lease from the land registry for £7. It's a form and a card payment, and it comes as a PDF in about 2 hours. I ordered it because it was £7, and because I wanted to know how much the rent on that building was, because I thought that number would tell me how frightened to be. The lease is 41 pages, and I read the whole thing over 2 nights with my phone in one hand looking up words. 25-year term from 2014. The rent was $48,000 a year, going up on review. And on page 39 there is a schedule, and the schedule is headed Guarantors, and there are 2 names on it. Theodore Andraze Vale, and underneath it, Brindis Okonjo Vale. My name, on a commercial lease, signed in June 2014. I was 19 in June 2014. I sat at my kitchen table at about 1 in the morning and did not move for a long time, and the thing I kept doing was reading my own name and trying to make it be somebody else's. And then I remembered, not all of it, a fragment. Standing in the office at the back of the Larkspur, the one with the safe and the bad chair, with my uncle, and a pen, and him saying something like, "Sign that for me, love, it's for the bank," and me signing it because I was 19, and it was Theodore, and he had given me a job at 17. I have absolutely no memory of reading anything. I do not think I was shown anything. I signed a page because a man I loved put it in front of me and said it was for the bank. That's it. That's how I became personally liable for a £48,000 a year commercial lease at the age of 19. Adeline Grieve Bassey has been doing commercial property for 24 years, and she gave me 40 minutes for nothing because I rang her firm and cried at the receptionist, which I am not proud of and which worked. She read the lease in about 11 minutes while I sat there. Then she took her glasses off and said, "Right, I'm going to tell you the position, and it isn't good, and then I'm going to tell you what we do about it. Here's the position," and it took her 4 minutes, and it rearranged my entire life. I am a guarantor on that lease, jointly and severally with my uncle, which means the landlord can pursue either of us for the whole amount, not half each. My uncle is dead, so there is one. When the business was sold in 2019, the tenant changed. The lease was assigned to Emmerich's company, but a guarantor is not automatically released when a lease is assigned. Releasing a guarantor requires a deed of release, which requires somebody to ask for one and to pay for it, and for the landlord to agree. Nobody asked. My uncle's solicitor was winding up a dead man's affairs and missed it. The buyer's solicitor had no reason to look because an outgoing tenant's guarantors are not the buyer's problem. So for 11 years, I have been personally, individually liable for the rent of a building I do not own, do not control, cannot enter after 10 p.m., and get paid $11.60 an hour to carry plates in. I said, what happens if they stop paying? And Adeline Grieve-Bassey said, then the landlord writes to the guarantors. I said, there's only one. And she said, yes. I asked her how much I'd be liable for, and she did the sum on a pad and turned it round. 14 years left on the term at $48,000 a year, plus the review, plus service charge, plus dilapidations at the end. The figure she wrote down was over £700,000. I laughed. I actually laughed at a solicitor in an office. The way I'd laughed at the police in a completely different story I'm not telling here. And she did not laugh. And she said, Brindis, I want you to understand that this is real. If that company goes under owing rent, the landlord's first port of call is a solvent guarantor with a clean file. That's you. It wouldn't be $700,000. They'd mitigate. They'd relet. But it could very easily be 60 or 70. And there is no version of that which you can pay. I said, I've got 340 quid. And she said, I know. That's not a defense. It's just a slower bankruptcy. I sat in that office and understood something that has permanently changed how I read anything anybody puts in front of me. For 11 years, every single time that restaurant had a good month, it had nothing to do with me. And every single time it had a bad one, I was one missed quarter away from losing everything I would ever have. I had been carrying that room since I was 19, and nobody in it, including me, had known. The folder was in my mother's loft in a box of Theodore's stuff that nobody had gone through in 7 years because that's what happens. I went up there on a Sunday looking for anything with the lease on it, and I found a green ring binder with the larkspur, property on the spine in his handwriting. And in it, in a plastic wallet, are 3 letters. The first is dated November 2016, from Theodore to the landlord's managing agent, and it asks, politely, badly spelled, with the wrong reference number, for his niece to be removed as a guarantor from the lease, on the grounds that she is a member of staff and not a director and should not have been asked. The second is the agent's reply, dated 3 weeks later, declining, 2 paragraphs. It says the guarantee was given for the term, and that the landlord does not consider a release appropriate at this time. The third is dated February 2017, and it is Theodore asking again. There is no fourth letter. He tried twice. He never told me. He died 14 months after that last letter, and I found out on my mother's loft floor with a torch, at 31. I sat up there for about half an hour, because I had spent 9 days building a version of my uncle where he'd been careless with me, and it turned out he'd been something worse and much more human, which is that he'd made a mistake at 44 and then spent 2 years quietly failing to fix it, and could not bring himself to tell a 22-year-old what he'd done. He gave me a job at 17, and a career, and about a third of who I am. And he also put my name on a page in an office with a bad chair, and I signed it because he asked me to. Both of those. That's the whole man, and I have had to take him as he came. There's one more thing in that folder, and I nearly missed it because it's on the back of the 2017 letter. A note in biro, in his handwriting, not addressed to anybody. Ring D. Re. B. 900. D is almost certainly Dilwyn, who was his solicitor. And 900 is, to the pound, what a deed of release costs, which I did not know when I found that note, and which Adeline told me 11 days later, and which made me sit down on the stairs. He'd got as far as a price. He knew what it cost to get me off it, and he knew a solicitor who could do it. And there is a note in biro on the back of a letter proving he was going to ring him. And then it's 2017, and the restaurant is going badly, and £900 is £900, and there is always next month. He died in the March. Emmerich Sloat paid that £900 in a room above a letting agent's office 8 years later, in about 4 seconds, because he had no other option. I have never worked out how to feel about those two facts being the same amount of money. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in February in a brown envelope. It was from a solicitor acting for the landlord, and it was addressed to me at my flat, and it referred to a rent review under a lease dated 2014, arrears of $11,400, and my position as guarantor. I stood in my hallway in my coat and read it twice, and then I rang in sick for the first time in 4 years. I want to describe the 11 weeks between the solicitor's office and that brown envelope, because that's the part of this that actually damaged me, and it is the part nobody ever asks about. I kept working there, every shift, 4, 5 a week, all through December and January, the Christmas parties, the New Year, the miserable dead fortnight after, carrying plates for a man who had made me count coins on a floor, in a building I was personally liable for, and saying nothing to anybody. I could not tell the staff because the second one person knows, everybody knows, and if it got to Emmerich before I understood my position, I would have handed him 11 weeks to prepare. I could not tell my mother, because she would have wanted to know what her brother had done, and I had not worked out how to say it yet. So I did Christmas Day service, 12 hours, 90 covers. I ran that floor, and I was good at it, because I am. And at about 4 in the afternoon, Emmerich handed round a bottle of something and said a few words about the team, and I stood there with a glass in my hand and clapped. I lost about half a stone in those 11 weeks, and I was not trying to. And the thing that got me was not fear of the money, in the the end. It was the double vision. Standing in a room I knew a fact about that changed what the room was, while everybody in it went about their evening. I have never in my life understood so completely what it is to know something. Here's what had been happening while I was carrying plates. The rent review was due. Emmerich had disputed it badly on his own, without a surveyor, and had then stopped responding. He was 3 months behind. And a landlord whose tenant is not paying and not answering does the obvious thing, which is to look at the guarantee schedule and see who else is on the hook. The first name is a dead man, so the letters came to me. The meeting was in a room above the letting agent's office on Caro Street on a Thursday morning in March, and it happened because Adeline told them in writing that the guarantor would attend and would be represented. There were 5 of us, me and Adeline, the landlord's agent, a very tired man called Price, the landlord's solicitor on a video call on a laptop propped on a box file, and Emmerich, who had been told there was a meeting about the review and had not been told who else was coming. He came in at 10 with a folder under his arm and his good jacket on, and he was halfway through saying something to Price when he saw me. I was sitting on the far side of the table with a solicitor next to me and a copy of the lease open at page 39, and he stopped. I have thought about those 11 seconds every week for 2 years. He genuinely could not process it. You could watch him try 3 separate explanations and discard all of them. She's here about wages, she's here about the staff, no. And then Adeline said, Mr. Sloat, Miss Okonjo Vale is a guarantor under the 2014 lease. She's here in that capacity. And Emmerich Sloat looked at me across the table and said, you're the guarantor? And I said, since I was 19. He sat down, not in a chair he'd chosen, in the nearest one, which was at the end, on his own, and he had to move a box file to do it. And then he said something that I did not expect, and which is the reason I have never been able to hate him as cleanly as I would like to. He said, nobody told me there was a second one. And Price, the agent, looked up from his papers and said, it's on the schedule, Mr. Sloat. It's been on the schedule since 2014. And Emmerich said, I've never read the schedule, which is, I have come to believe, completely true. He bought a business in 2019 with a solicitor who cost him £1,400, and he has never once read page 39 of the lease he trades under. And he did not know, in November, when he tipped a jar onto the floor, that the woman he was pointing at was the reason his rent got paid when his company couldn't. He wasn't humiliating somebody he knew had power over him. He was humiliating a waitress. That's worse. I have gone round it 100 times, and it is definitely worse. What happened in that room over the next 2 hours is the least dramatic thing in this entire story, and I'm going to tell it properly, because the version people want is not what occurred. I did not own the building. I want to say that plainly because about half the people I have told this to have assumed, at that point in the story, that I did. I had no power over Emmerich at all. I could not sack him, could not evict him, could not take the restaurant. What I had was risk. That's all a guarantee is. It is the right to be pursued for somebody else's debt. And what that meant, in that room, was that I was the one person present who could not be ignored. Because a landlord cannot settle a review over a guarantor's head. And because if it went to court, the person they would sue is the one with a clean credit file and a permanent address. And that was me and not the company. So for 2 hours, I sat in a room where my rent, my credit, and the next 10 years of my life were being discussed. And every so often, somebody asked me a question, and I answered it, and Emmerich sat 4 feet away and could not look at me. There is one exchange from that morning that I think about more than the 11 seconds. About an hour in, the solicitor on the laptop asked whether the guarantor understood the extent of her obligation, and Adeline said, she does now. She didn't when she signed it. She was 19, and she had no independent advice, and there is no certificate on that deed to say otherwise. There was a pause on the video call, and then the man said, noted, and typed something. And I said, and I had not planned to say anything, and Adeline put her hand flat on the table, which I now know means stop talking. I said, does that mean it wouldn't have stood up? And the solicitor on the laptop said carefully, it means there'd have been an argument. There'd have been an argument. 11 years, £700,000 of theoretical exposure, 2 letters from a dead man to an agent, a note in biro about 900 quid, and underneath all of it, the whole time, there had been an argument available. If I'd ever known there was something to argue about, and if I'd ever had £400 to ask somebody. That's the actual moral of this, and it is not a satisfying one. It isn't that I was clever. I wasn't clever. I ordered a PDF for £7 because I wanted to know how frightened to be. The only thing I did right in 11 years was look. At about 11:30, Price said the thing that ended it. He said, look, we've no interest in pursuing a waitress. We want the rent. Sort a deed of release for her and we'll do the review at the mid-figure. Adeline said, the release is £900 plus VAT, and Price looked at Emmerich. And Emmerich Sloat, in a room above a letting agent, said, fine, that's it. That is the entire reversal. A man who made me count coins on a floor said the word fine about £900, and I got my name back. I was released on the 11th of April. I did not get money. I did not get an apology. I have never had one. Not then, and not since. I did not get the restaurant or a share of it or anything at all except a deed with my name on it saying I am no longer liable for a building I served in for 14 years. I worked 2 more weeks. Full notice. I did my shifts, and I was perfectly professional, and Emmerich and I said about 9 sentences to each other, all of them about covers. On my last Saturday, at the end of service, he came out of the office and said, you could have dropped me in it. And I said, yes. And he said, why didn't you? I have thought about my answer a lot since, and it wasn't noble, and I want to be honest about that. I said, because 11 people work here. He said, right, and went back in the office. And that's the last conversation I had with him. I told my mother in the May, after it was all done, because I could not work out how to tell her while it was happening, and because I was frightened of what it would do to how she thought about her brother. I did it properly. I sat her down with the 3 letters, and I made her a cup of tea, and I said it in order. She was quiet all the way through it. And at the end, she picked up the 2016 letter and read it again and said, he spelled guarantor wrong. That's what she said. That's the first thing. And then she cried for about 10 minutes. And then she said, the thing that I have kept. She said, he'd have told you in the end. He was working up to it. I said, ma'am, it was 2 years. And my mother said, Bryn, it took him 4 years to tell me he'd paid for the roof. People ask me why I didn't burn it down, and I understand the question. I could have. Adeline told me in the meeting in a whisper exactly what my position allowed. I could have refused to attend, forced the landlord's hand, and made the situation so procedurally awkward that the lease would very likely have fallen in, and the Larkspur would have closed inside 3 months. I would have got the same release either way. The landlord did not want a waitress. He wanted rent. And 11 people would have lost their jobs in a town with 9 decent kitchens, including 2 commis chefs who laughed at me on a Saturday night, and Marnie, who went and got a tray she didn't need, and Kez, who looked at the board. I have thought about Marnie a lot. She was the one who hurt, but I could not work out a version where I hurt Emmerich Sloat that did not go through her. And once I'd worked that out properly, there wasn't a decision left to make. That's the whole reason, and it's less satisfying than the alternative, and it's the truth. The Larkspur closed 14 months later anyway. February, with about a week's notice, exactly the way I said at the start that they do. I did not feel anything much about it, which surprised me. I drove past about a fortnight after, and there was brown paper on the inside of the windows and a letting board up. And I looked at the corner where the pass was and thought about the tiles, and then the lights changed and I drove on. I'm a supervisor now at a much duller place out on the ring road. Chain. Rhoda published 3 weeks ahead, contracted hours, sick pay, a proper HR portal. It is not a patch on the Larkspur on a Good Friday, and I will never love it, and I have not counted anything off a floor since. I have one rule now that I did not have before, and I make everybody I train do it, and they all think I'm mad. Before you sign anything at work, anything, a rota variation, a training agreement, a form somebody's holding out at a pass with a pen, you take a photograph of it on your phone. Not to read, just to have. Most of them don't. One girl asked me why, and I gave her the short version, that I signed something at 19 and found out at 31, and she said, God, what was it? And I said, a lease. And she said, what, for the building? And laughed because it sounds like a joke. And I said, yes. And she stopped laughing about 4 seconds later when she worked out I wasn't joking. She takes the photographs now. 2 of the commas came with me, including the one who laughed. He asked me about 4 months in whether it was all right that he was there, and I said yes, and it was, and we've never discussed it since. Emmerich sent me a text 9 months after it closed. 3 words, hope you're well. I never answered it, and I'm not going to. The deed of release is in a folder in my wardrobe with my passport and my birth certificate and my mother's power of attorney. It's 2 pages, and it's got a seal on it, and it does absolutely nothing for anybody, except confirm that a thing which was true is no longer true. And underneath it, in the same folder, are the 3 letters from the loft, because those belong with it. Somebody asked me last year what I'd have done if I'd found the lease at 22 while my uncle was alive. I said I'd have gone and asked him about it. And they said, and what would he have said? And I said, he'd have told me he was sorting it, which he was. That's the thing, he was.